Hello, and there is another opening forum. Almost every chess player I have met on different levels, on the levels beginning like maybe from 1500 and going all the way to maybe 2500. Similarity of the questions or suggestions or worries they have is unbelievably high. And it's always the same. How to play against this opening. Just a quick guide to get out of this opening with a reasonable position. Without studying countless variations and getting into turmoil of combinations and something you have to remember, a lot of theory. What is the easy way of getting out this on that opening? And one of these questions was regarding c4 move, English. I've already made a tape, DVD, how to play English the easy way for white. Well, what do we do if we play black? Suppose you are a King's Indian player. Here is the problem you're facing. If you are King's Indian player, you may not necessarily get King's Indian. You may get English opening, which means by that white may never play d4. White may go e4, knight e2, or white may play knight f3 and later d3. So that's not quite King's Indian. Suppose you want to play, you are Nimzovich player, and you want to play knight f6 and knight c3, e6. You don't necessarily get Nimzovich opening because you may get e4. That's an English, and you have to study quite a bit of theory. You may not be very happy with it. Suppose you are Grunfeld player. You may not get the Grunfeld the way you want. For example, white can go knight c3, g6, g3. Well, it's kind of a Grunfeld variety, but it's not exactly Grunfeld defense because white may never play d4. So is there a universal answer to the c4 move? I made a lot of attempts to do that for black. Well, because I play almost every opening I used to play, because unfortunately, I've been around for way too long, and the reason for that is my age. So I have tried everything, and I tried to explore different possibilities. And you know that for white, on Sicilian, why am I changing subject? I will explain now. I try to advocate this opening, which is kind of Grand Prix ideas. Now I have combined ideas of that opening for white variety of Sicilian with some English variation. For example, c4. This is typical English position. Knight f3, knight c6, e3 or g3, and bishop b4. So I'm combining these two, and I came out with very interesting way to play this opening against c4. And I've played many games. Of course, they were not serious tournament games because I'm retired for several years, and I played only on the internet, and I played against players, quite strong players, and a lot of GMs, and a lot of 24, 2500 or 2300. So I doubt that you're going to play, your opponent is in tournament going to play much, much stronger than that. But I had great success with it. I won big majority of my games. In most of the cases, I wasn't even better than my opponent. But I played because I knew what I was doing better. And every time, actually, it's not important whether you won or not. The important is result of the opening. Result of the opening means position you came out with. And the biggest advantage of it all, actually two of them. You have a clear plan. You have very clear plan in most of the cases. And the other thing is that you will be familiar with it a lot better than your opponent. Oh, there we go. That's good enough incentive for you to adapt the system and to play. c4, I would go e5. And of course, before we get to the essence, to the main ideas here, well, you'll say this position is million years old and there were million games played with it, of course. But we played little differently. Now, before we get to the main continuations, starting with knight c3 or g3, I don't want to really discuss knight f3 move, e4, knight d4, and knight c6. This is favoring black, and there is a very famous game played between Bent Larsen and Boris Spassky, which Spassky won, I think, in like 17 moves with black. You can research for that. So we don't want to get in some weird continuations, maybe like this. What you do in those cases, your opponent does. Obviously, you're not going to panic. You're going to just develop and play chess as you know, the best you know, because this move does not create opening problems. Our problem here, our goal and mission is to show you if your opponent tried to play by book and get an advantage. So what do we do then? c4, e5, and there are two moves, g3 or knight c3. There's some difference about these moves, but we're going to go through both of them. Knight c3, knight f6, and here your opponent may go g3 or knight f3. First of all, I want to talk about knight f3 move. Knight f3, we obviously go knight c6. And now your opponent may play g3, which is the main theoretical move, and we're going to discuss that. They may go d4, which was popular at some point. Well, after d4, ed, knight takes d4, bishop b4. Based on latest thinking and theory, black is doing okay. Now, I don't want to go into details of it. You can look what modern theory says and follow it. d4 is very rare move these days. After bishop b4, black is doing okay, and I don't have any innovations on my own in this position because I don't think there is a need for it. The main move, well, there is D3 move or E3 move. On D3 or E3, you will play bishop B4, as we're gonna see soon, and G3 is the main move. The main move in this position is G3, and then we go simply bishop B4. Now, some people like to play A3, but you see, if you play A3 after D5, CD, knight takes D5, you have very well-known Sicilian position. Sicilian, if it was reversed color, white has an extra tempo A3, and that's not the tempo that can give them any advantage. So this is one way to play, and the other way to play against A3 move is to simply go bishop E7 and play D5 later. So that's not something that creates problem for us. So the move is G3. I want to play bishop B4, and here are two continuations for white. One is bishop G2. So far we are in the theory, and the other one is knight D5. Let's look at them. Bishop G2. On this move, what I want to do, normally black castles, I want to take on C3 right away without wasting any time. And if white takes with a B pawn, here comes our main plan. We go D6, white castles, we castle. Nothing new so far. This position, I think it's a good position for black. D3. The important move in this position is H6. It's important for more than one reason. First of all, we don't want bishop to go to G5. We don't want exchange, black to exchange dark square bishop, because that will increase the power of light square bishop after D2. Light square bishop will be dominating on the long diagonal. This is one reason we play H6. The other reason we intending to play bishop E6, we want to stop knight G5. And the third reason, when we go H6, as you will see later in the future, so we're going to play knight H7. But first we go H6 without knowing what white's plan is. Suppose white goes rook B1. We can go rook B8 because we are intending to play bishop E6. And now frequently white plays knight E1, C2, E3, D5, or E4 move. Well, in this position, if white plays E4, I suggest two things here. First of all, I suggest one idea is to play A6 followed by B5, and if white plays A4, bishop D7, and try to make A5 anyway, maybe even queen E8 as an idea. But second idea, I would suggest to go bishop E6. If white goes knight E1, notice they want F4. we can simply play knight h7 and meet f4 with f5. This is very playable and good position for black. So bishop e6, and if white doesn't play knight e1, trying to go f4, then we're going to go queen d7 and bishop h3. So this is kind of handbook of how to play these positions. I want to tell you something, and that's very important for adapting this system against English. When you play, there is no theory there. I just played and I found myself very successful playing it. Well, there are a number of ideas. You have to know the ideas, why you play this, what your plan is. In a lot of cases, your plan is doubling your opponent's pawns, or on c3, as I already mentioned, this kind of pawn structure, and the play on a king side, and in some other cases, it's just to opening center. You have to know when to do what. And I have number of games that are very typical for basic ideas of this opening. Now, c45, knight c3, knight f6. We're going to go through those games. They are very typical and very helpful. Now, g3, we go bishop b4, and we take on d5 the first chance we get. After knight d5, we will probably go bishop c5, and taking on d5 is not wrong at all. This is one structural position you have to know. d6, if your opponent goes knight f3, you will go bishop a5, castle. As a structure, this position is okay for black. Now, can black go d4? Can white go d4? Or can white go e4, followed by d4? Now, knowing basics of the strategy, d4 we can go e4, and after knight d2, f5. e4 is a positional mistake since gives this black square bishop total control on diagonal, and white will never be able to play d4 after bishop g4 move. Eventually bishop will be exchanged, light square bishop blacks will be exchanged for knights, and black will have dominant control on a7 g1 diagonal. So if white goes d3, then what we're going to do, obviously, just several ways you can play. You can go c6 and establish good center, or you can be more ambitious, like going bishop g4, knight d7, followed by f5. They are both good ways to play. So the basic ideas of these openings, you have to know. Actually, since there is no much theory, what will be very important for you to pay close attention to the games we will analyze in a little bit. But before we do, let me show you another way to play for white. g3, and a lot of times white is trying to prevent black's bishop b4, which looks very silly, before knight develops from b1. So in this position, we go knight c6, but now white has to do something with the knight, and then when they go knight c3, we go bishop b4. Now they may go knight d5. See, now our knight on c6, and if we take on d5, we're going to have to move this knight after cd. So what I would recommend, what I would play here, in this position, we have two options, actually. We can go simply bishop c5, and we will discuss it in a second, and the other option is d6. Some people may be reluctant playing d6 because it creates, well, black loses a pawn after knight takes b4 and queen a4 check. But that's not the kind of pawn if I would be happy to win if I was white. So I made several moves with a queen. My light square bishop is gone and I'm behind in development. But if you don't want to sacrifice the pawn, of course you don't have to. We don't want to go into details what happens after sacrificing the pawn. You can go bishop c5, and after knight f3, d6, castle, we castle, and now d3. Now let's talk about this position. This is another position that is unorthodox and is okay for black to play. Knight takes d5 is one move to play, and the other option is h6. You have to stop bishop g5 here. Position after knight takes d5, ed, I played several times. And it's interesting, I was discussing this position with Anatoly Karpov, who agrees with me that after knight e7, white's best response d4, e takes d, knight takes d4. White has centralized knight, more space, and better pawn structure. What does black have? Black has, in my opinion, more than sufficient counterplay for that. They can go knight g6, rook e8. They have very strong bishop on c5. Also, they can go knight f5. And notice this position looks like, it looks like better pawn structure for white. No, but white has no counterplay, no play. On e4, we can go bishop d7. And later on, we can go f5. You see, this is the type of position I would love to play for black, because eventually, when knights are exchanged, black has very powerful two bishops, much better than white's two bishops. And this is the position I would never play when I play Grand Prix for white. If I had an extra tempo in this position, my pawn would be here. Oh, this is a bad position for black. So if I was playing, if we reverse colors, we had this position with extra tempo f5, which might have happened from Grand Prix Sicilian that we play. Then f5 makes whole difference in evaluation of this position. Not to mention, bishop is blocked, knight can never go to f5, and there is a hole on e6. That's a real bad position for black. However, after knight f5, knight b3, bishop b6, rook e8 bishop d7 and queen f6, black has very comfortable position. That's a big difference between having extra tempo with f5 if we were white in Grand Prix. Some of the people who follow my DVDs and they know how we play Grand Prix and they adapt it, they play themselves, they would very well understand the difference. Now going back to c45, knight f3, no, pawn g3, knight f6, bishop g2, knight c6, knight c3, bishop b4. Now notice, e4 or e3 or e4, we're going to take on c3. Now, e3 is particularly bad move. It's a real bad move, because after taking on c3, if you are familiar with Grand Prix ideas, where white has the pawn on f5 as well, pawn on f7 is even better, because it doesn't block our bishop. So now, if you just go castle followed by d6 and e4, white is going to have terrible time on c1. If you, with bishop on c1, if you have difficulties understanding these positions, I can explain it in details if you are willing to contact me. But for now, we're going to stop at that. And if in this position, after bishop b4, white goes e4, we obviously have different option. Now there's a different option which I like very much. I like to simply castle or go d6. It doesn't make any difference. After knight e2, I can go d6 myself. After castling, I want to retreat my bishop to c5. Now I have good grip on d4 square. If white goes d3, I go h6. And my plan is to play bishop e6, queen d7, and bishop h3. And if white tries to go quick f4 and have kingside attack, that may backfire, because when we go bishop, I don't know, maybe bishop d7. Bishop d7, I may prefer to bishop e6, because after f4 there will be no f5 with the tempo. I think both moves are okay. With f4 we may have knight g4. This is the typical for this positions shot, and you have to know them. This shot, well, this is not just a knight f2 threat. It's more than that. Black also has positional threat of winning, of getting white's dark square bishop and having dark square control on all board. On top of everything, there is a f5 move, which, if you look, black's pieces are a lot more active than white's. And this position almost always favors black. So that's the way I would play if white went e4 after bishop e4. After e4, I would go d6 or castle or bishop c5. That doesn't make difference, move order, because the plan you have to understand. And in all this system, you have to understand your strategical plan more than just remembering variations. No. Remembering variations are not going to do you any good because there aren't any. So, and after knight f3 here, we take on c3, and we take on c3 and go d6. Now white castles, black castles. As soon as white goes d3, remember, preserve your knight on f6. Go h6. Your plan, bishop e6, queen d7, and bishop h3. In one of my games, my opponent played knight e1, knight c2, and tried to play knight e3, knight d5. On that, I reacted differently, and we're going to talk about it when I get to the game part where I analyze some games. And this part, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is the most important part because it emphasizes all positional ideas and teaches you a lot about strategy. That's why I widely recommend to play this system. You will learn a lot about strategy. So, now I would like to go through some games that was played with this system, and as we go, I will try to explain basic ideas behind certain moves and behind the whole system. Something I already explained in a theoretical part. Now we're going to see all this in practice. Games were played on relatively high level, but I played them on internet against quite strong players, at least strong masters. Every game white was played by a relatively good master, and we see how they failed to get good position. First game, c4, e5. I'm not going to mention names of these players because when you play on internet, you don't have names, you have the handles. And based on handles, and I know these players, they are not weak players. Knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, g3, and bishop d3 actually was played in this position, and bishop b4. Bishop d2, we go bishop b4 almost any time there is knight on c3. After bishop d2, black castled, white went g3, d6, bishop g2, h6. We want to play bishop on e6, put the bishop on e6, and we stop knight g5. So, after h6, a3 was played, black takes, white takes, bishop e6. Well, maybe white should have castled. White played b4. By no means this is a mistake. It's okay move. And after b4, queen d7, castle, and bishop h3. This is the plan I already explained. Black wants to exchange light square bishop, go knight h7 and f5, possibly f4 and knight g5, starting kingside attack. Well, white needs a play on its own. They have to come up with constructive plans. So after bishop h3 there was d4 move. Now we cannot go actually knight h7 because center is open, and with open center you don't like to go knight away from the center. So black has to respond to d4 move appropriately. So after, actually it was b5 played, knight e7, and then d4. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, and e4. Knight d2. Here we can conclude already that black has a very, very good position. Actually, black has very good advantage already. d5 was played. Now, c takes d is obviously bad because after knight takes d5, how do I evaluate this position? This position can be evaluated concretely and can be evaluated strategically. In both cases, it's very bad for white. Knight is hanging, bishop is hanging, and when bishop moves, e3 will be played. Secondly, that's concrete explanation, which is good enough, sufficient enough. Knight on d5 is dominating, and black has big space advantage on a king side. They can start eventually king side attack. So this move, c takes d, is bad. Bishop b4 was played, and rook f2, e8. Now, white has serious problem. e3 is threatening. Also threatening pawn takes pawn, and b5 pawn will be hanging. So white tried to protect the pawn a4, and now e3. Remember, any time, most of the time, like I would say 90% of the time, if you can go e3, sacrifice this pawn, and then put pressure on it, it's very good for black. And this case is not an exception. e3 was played, and after e3, I think white is lost here. If pawn takes, then knight f5, followed by knight g4, overwhelming threats. Knight f3 was played, which leaves a c4 pawn unattended. D takes c, queen c2. Of course, I could have played simply knight d5, which gives me very good position, but e takes f was very strong as well. After e takes f, e4. What else for white to do? If they take on f2, there will be absolute disaster after knight d5, threatening bishop, coming knight e4, threatening knight e3 check, and bishop d2 c3, and pawn is immune. White is absolutely lost. So e4 was played. Now this is an attempt to get strong center, but white is already 2 pawns down. Of course they're going to get one back, and positioned is very artificial piece position by white, and very fragile center pawns. So white is absolutely lost after e4. What happened on e4 is knight g6, e5, knight g6 attacking e4 pawn, and after e5, knight d5, creating threat and another threat. So, and after d5, knight d5, bishop d2, c3. Of course, taking is bad because of fork. And after bishop c1, it's simply a6. Now b takes a, rook takes a6, rook takes f2, rook e2 a8, queen b3, b5, and look, white has material deficit and totally busted strategically. After rook b1, b4 was played. Now black has two connected pass pawns. I took the pawn next move. There is absolutely no need to further continue with this game. This is very typical. White hasn't done any disastrous mistakes. And you see our good positional planning. What we did is everything is very easy to understand and very easy to adapt. Now, I want to go to the next game, which was played also by a good player. C4, E5, G3, knight F6. We said about this little delay of knight C3 move. Bishop G2, knight C6, knight C3, bishop B4, knight D5. Well, normally we do go D6, but I played A5, which does not interfere with the general strategy. A5, A3, bishop C5, D3, very necessary move, H6, to stop bishop G5, potentially. E3, D6, knight E2, castle, knight C3, knight takes D5, and knight takes D5. Now, another option is to take with a pawn, but we go knight E7. Now, how do we look at this position? If white plays D4, we can take and go back with a bishop. We have bad bishop. No, that's not a bad bishop. That bishop that puts pressure on D4, and then knight F5. Bishop can come alive by playing C6 in much later stage, or A4 and bishop A5. Meanwhile, it's fine where it is, putting a lot of pressure on D4 pawn. So that's not a bad position for bishop. So knight took on D5, knight E7, white castle, knight takes D5, and bishop takes D5. This position is better for black. Now, why is this position better for black? There are 8 pawns, no weaknesses on either side. What is white's problem? White's problem is that they don't have a play. They don't have a plan. Black can do many things. They can go C6 and D5. Oh, bishop H3 was played, the move. Now, after bishop H3, rook E1. What happens after? If white plays bishop takes B7, black will take the rook, and after bishop simply takes on D3, black has better position. If bishop moves, we can go E4, and if we exchange bishops, if white takes bishop, queen takes bishop, you see black is much better. They can go a4, rook b8, better pawn structure. So the natural move, it's not a bad player for with white. So on bishop h3 he played natural rook e1, and after c6 bishop h1, trying to keep this bishop alive. After bishop g2 we would take and go d5, have clear, small but clear advantage with black. After bishop h1, white plays queen, black plays queen d7, white goes rook b1, naturally wants to go b4, and f5. Of course, there's a possibility of going a4, which is not bad, but there is nothing wrong with f5 move, d4. Now, this is already a mistake. It's understandable white is trying to stop black's f4 attempt. After d4, e takes d, e takes d, and bishop a7. And it's always difficult correctly, so some people, to correctly evaluate power of this bishop. This bishop is very powerful piece in this position because it attacks d4 pawn, which can never move because gives this bishop on a7 laser power. So after bishop a7, white has certain problems to overcome. b4 was played, rook a to e8. That's the first sign of weakness of d4 pawn. We're trying to exchange rooks and take this pawn. Bishop e3 and f4. Bishop e3 was already a mistake, and this is the end of the game. White should have played bishop b2, but then f4 anyway. Black has very strong attack, but after bishop e3 and f4, white is simply lost. Bishop takes f4, fails to crushing, rook takes one, queen takes one, and rook takes f4, followed by checkmate after queen g4. So the bishop is hanging and has to move back to d2. Now bishop takes d4. That's the power of a laser bishop. Rook takes e8. Queen takes e8, keeping the rook on f file. And after bishop e1, f takes g. It's a little tactics based on a rook on b1. Of course, even if if black simply played c5 here, or moved the bishop, black is winning anyway. But after f takes g, this is an elementary tactic. Queen takes d4, g takes f, check, bishop takes f2, queen g6, check, and after black takes rook on b1, white gets mated. And now this f5 and f4, that's what I've been talking in a theoretical part in beginning of the tape. So what we want to do, we want to play queen d7, bishop h3, and then go f5, f4. Those are the ideas. That's how we play. Those are our ideas in Grand Prix Sicilian when we play for white, whoever is playing that system and adapted that system for white. That's a similar type of attack, and it's very much planned. This is planned thing. So if you play this part of this way against the English defense, you are likely to get a lot of positions that you will know what your plan is, and you're going to have easy time playing it. Here is another game against a strong international master that plays English opening practically all his life. Knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, g3, bishop b4, knight d5, d6. He played knight takes b4, knight takes b4, and bishop g2. Okay, this is position that is very common for this type of opening, for our opening. And the normal move, always castle. Here, I made another move, which is very well within the general idea of the opening. But I had a good feeling that my opponent wanted, after castle, to play maybe d4 quickly. So what I did, since my plan is to put bishop on e6, pawn on h6, and then queen d7, I wanted at the same time to stop d4 move. So I played c5. And again, this is not necessary move, but it's very interesting and worked out just fine in this game. And I cannot tell you always play c5, because your opponent could have played in the last move instead of bishop g2. He could have played a3. So c5 is kind of luxury, like another way to play, but it's not up to you that you can make c5 every time. So bishop g2, c5, that both sides castled, d3 is played, h6, stopping bishop g5, and in this position it's very important to stop bishop g5, because, and again I explain, I already mentioned it before, after exchanging, white exchanges this dark square bishop for our knight. Well, I gotta mention that knight is very important for controlling central squares and also for attacking on a king side. So you have to notice here that after exchanging, white is going to have dominant control on diagonal using their light square bishop. So it's always necessary to play h6, a3, knight c6, rook b1, a5, stopping b4. And here, my opponent went knight e1. Now, the idea is knight c2, knight e3, knight d5. Knight e1, bishop e6, and knight c2. Here I want to talk to you about this position. Queen d7 followed by bishop h3 is still okay plan. But white does not have a knight on c3. which normally controls the central squares d5 and e4. White doesn't have that knight. They have knight on c2. In other words, they played from knight in f3 to e1 and c2. They don't have control in the center, and they lost 2 tempos moving knight on c3. We go d5 here. Queen d7 was still okay. If you don't want to depart from the main idea, queen d7 was okay. But d5 here is much, much stronger. After c takes d, bishop takes d5. Because you want to exchange light square bishop. This bishop is a very strong piece and also good protector for white's king. Remember when we play queen d7 and bishop h3? This is the idea. That's why we play, to get this bishop. Here, we do it the other way. Bishop takes d5, and we still exchanging light square bishops. Knight e3, bishop takes g2, king takes g2. And now after knight d4, black has big advantage. They totally control center, and they have big space advantage. And after knight d4, we may want to go a4 and knight b3. Have white living with almost no space to maneuver with the pieces. Besides, knight on d4 is very powerful, so knight c2 was played. And the rook e8, that's it. That's a good move. It's a lot of good moves in this position. a4 would have been okay also. But the rook e8, if white wants to take on d4, we take with e pawn, and you will see the weakness of e2. So, however, the b4 was played. After b4, you see how passive white's pieces are. And they make b4 the open position. Normally this is wrong, but also staying passive is also not a good idea. So after b4, knight d5, threatening cheap but very powerful knight c3 threat, bishop d2, and there comes positional solution, strategical solution for whole game plan. C takes b, a takes b, and a4. We don't want white to activate the rook on b1. We don't want to open b file. And we want to keep pushing the pawn. Knight a3, queen d7, e4. And what is the good square for knight? This knight has to go from d5 to b5 without violating rules of chess. So knight c7 is the move. And after bishop e3, knight c to b5, knight takes b5, knight takes b5. This is ideal position for knight. It's totally dominating square on b5, which controls queen side and the center. It cannot be chased away from b5, supports the a pawn, and makes d3 pawn very weak. White is totally lost here. Queen d2 was played, a3, rook f to c1, rook a6. Now we want to push the pawn and play and support with the rook from a8 to a8, and we also have an option to go against d3 pawn. This is universal, very strong move. Rook a1, rook d6. There is the power of knight on b5. Supports. Pawn on a3 needs no support besides knight. Rook d6, rook d1, and rook d8. On top of all its trouble, white is also losing a pawn now. d4. Now knight takes d4. Rook cannot take because of knight b5. And all white's pieces are hanging. Taking on d4 also devastating. So after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. That's what happened. Actually, it doesn't matter anymore. Rook takes d4. White simply resigns. This is, well, I don't see any particularly strong move was played by black. So black had what I did in this game. I did everything I supposed to do in the opening, and then I got an additional chance to play d5 in open position. But even if I continued with my plan, I think I would have gotten a very good game and would have been successful in this game. This next game, my opponent here was German grandmaster. c4, e5, and it's interesting how quickly he got worse position with white. g3, knight f6, bishop g2, knight c6, knight c3, bishop b4, knight d5, castles. I always abandon this bishop on b4. Knight takes b4, knight takes b4, d3, knight c6, a3, d6, and let's talk about this position a little bit. Why this is okay to play for black? Isn't it like almost very close identical pawn structure, and white has two bishops? Yes, but white's two bishops are not very active. Well, there is a good bishop on g2. That's why we want always to exchange that bishop. And white does not have good grounds for bishops. So, which I mean, position is not open. So, white made a move e3 in this position, which I very much dislike. There is a rule which I adapt in various different openings. In Sicilian, there's sometimes in a lot of different kinds of English positions, and sometimes in other openings. Don't, if you go e3 and g3, don't allow your opponent to go d5. This I mentioned several times on my Grand Prix tapes. So there we play white, so the rule goes for black. Don't go g6 and e6 if white can go d4. So here, white went e3 and g3 when black can go d5. And this is not a good idea. This is something we should know. So now black can go d5, but we want to go d5 and take on d5 with a bishop. So before I went d5, I went bishop e6. I went bishop e6, and now good thing about it that I don't have to go h6 because bishop is blocked and white cannot go knight, bishop g5. I went bishop e6, he went knight e2, and now after d5, black has an advantage, and a serious advantage. d5, if cd, bishop takes d5, d3 pawn is going to be big liability. For example, if white castles, black can take the bishop, give queen d5 check, and go rook d8. It's going to be very weak pawn. White already has to solve some problems. So here he saw that he shouldn't allow e5 and he d5 and he went c5. But now black has total control in the center. Queen d7, b4, bishop h3, castle, bishop takes g2, king takes g2. And here I played an interesting plan, not necessarily the best. If I had to play this game again, I would have simply played rook e8, rook d8, going a6, and try to pursue the same plan of attacking on a king's side. This is the normal circumstances, normal plan. That's, I think, what you should do. So, but what I did in this position, I went b5. The queen is on d7. I did b5 because, after b4, so I did b5 because I never wanted him to play b5 and chase my knight away. I like my knight being placed. So c takes b was played, and a takes b. Now this switches why black's plan from playing on a king side to playing on queen side, because now queen side is open, and we have to pay attention to it. After bishop b2, if we go now and attack the king side, white will have counterplay on a queen side. So after bishop b, after bishop b2, rook fe8, queen c2, I want b5. We don't want white to go b5. And after b5, rook fc1, rook a6. Black still has very good position. White has no plan. h3 and d4. Idea of d4 is obvious. Now, if white takes, they may have serious problems on the king side, because queen d5 check, followed by knight e5, and you will see there are very strong threats. So obviously my opponent didn't allow this, and on d4 he went e4. But then it's a positional aspect to it. That makes bishop on b2 absolutely dead piece. And that's not very good. After d4 and e4, queen d6 was played, and after queen c5, rook b6, simply protecting pawn. Queen takes d6, cd, and rook c2. This is undoubtedly a big positional advantage for black. Why? Black always has potential for d5. What I should have done here, I should have simply played with a would come with a king closer to d7. If my opponent rook c1 he plays, then I can always move the knight. I should have kept my center strong and kept this bishop on b2. Bishop on b2 is terrible, and knight on e2 is not much better. But I decided I was overly ambitious and I went d5. That's not necessarily a bad move, but I don't think it's good positional. If I had more time on my clock, I would have chosen different continuation. I would have played against these two dead pieces. d5, however, was played. f3, de, fe. The reason, that's why I did it, and I did it for knight takes e4 move, because otherwise rook c5 comes. So I did knight takes e4, and my opponent made a very strong move, rook c1. And I have to go now knight c3, knight takes c3, dc, rook takes c3, and rook e6. Black still has an advantage, and still difficult for white to come up with a constructive play. Well, rook c5, the advantage is strictly on a pawn structure, f6, rook d5, knight e7. We want to put the rook on d6 and attack the weak pawn. Rook d8 check, king f7, d4. But that's a mistake. Now white is lost. After rook e2 d6, rooks have to be exchanged, and pawn on d4 is hanging and disabling white to play d takes c, because rook d2 wins the bishop. And after rook d1, knight f5, king f3, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, white played rook c1, and black gave check to the pawn, and I won the game quickly. But however, if white decided to go to pawn endgame, that's an absolutely lost endgame for white, because after king d6, black practically has an extra pawn, because a4 cannot be played, and black advances 3 pawns versus 2 on the king side and wins. An attempt to make pass pawn is going to fail terribly. g5, and after a4, we just take and go f4. And so I won the game. That's absolutely lost position. So this was very instructive game. Well, I didn't play it my best, but still got more in the opening that you can get in any other opening almost. I got an advantage with 2 different very good plans to go with. Very interesting positional concept. We're going to see next game. Again, my opponent is quite strong player, and I got very good position. There was, of course, mistakes on both sides due to a time control, but that doesn't take away from the fact that how basic strategy was conducted. So c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, g3, bishop b4. As I already mentioned, this is the most common way to play for white. Knight d5, d6, Knight takes b4. Knight takes b4. d3. Castle. a3. Knight c6. As you remember, we already mentioned, on d3, here I castled, but in one of the games that we already went through, I played c5. They are both very playable, of course. I castled, a3, knight c6. Sometimes when I play one move in one game and different move in the other game, that means a value is about the same value. I don't give much preference to one or the other. And after bishop g2, h6, b3. Now, b3 can be played with one idea only, d4 to go. Maybe not right away, maybe later. But on b3, I tried to put my bishop, instead of bishop e6, which is most common move, I played bishop f5. The same idea, not much different. Notice, again, this is blitz games, and sometimes I like to vary, but it does not depart from the main positional ideas. Queen d7, rook e1. This is very typical move in order to preserve the light square bishop. Bishop h3, bishop h1. And here we have to go f5 and f4. So knight h7. That's the plan. You see how in every game we look, we get the ideas that I explained briefly in the opening part. What are our ideas? Knight h7, d4, e4, knight d2, and again I said that 90% of the time if you can go e3 and after fe play against these weaknesses, it's good. This is not an exception. Rook a to e8. Obviously white cannot push e4 because of knight takes d4. Knight f3, knight f6, and now we know this pawn is blocked, and we have outpost on e4, and we have potentially bad bishop on c1. Knight f6, queen d3, bishop f5, queen d1, queen d3 was bad move, knight e4, b4, queen is after b4, in this position white has a choice. After we went knight e4, white has a choice to, when they played b4, to go for queenside play or to try to put bishop on a very, very active position. So knight e4, b4, queen e7, b4 was played, queen e7, bishop b2, queen b3 could have been played also. But what happened basically in the game is white went actually in this position, b4, making absolutely no effort to play, to somehow free the bishop and to go e4. They could have done knight d2, but then knight c3 wins the queen. They could have played rook a2. then also knight c3. So what can be done? They could have tried somehow to exchange knights and push the e-pawn finally. But that's impossible. Black has very strong grip. Actually, in this position, what I did, I played queen e6. Well, of course, d5, we will go queen f6. That will make black's position even stronger because rook is hanging on a1 and knight is going to come to e5. So after queen e6, queen b3 was played. b4 is played. Queen e6, we attack the c4 pawn. Queen b3, queen g6. Now this move I do not like because I'm exchanging my light square bishop. The move I like better is knight e7. Knight is practically the only piece that is not standing well. I should try to put it on some better positions. So I played queen g6. That was error. And after knight h4, queen g5, knight takes f5, queen takes f5, rook f1, bishop g6, queen g6, bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and b5. Knight went to e7. This is very, very difficult position for white. Knight is coming to f5, and I have a lot of pressure on the king side. Queen d3, rook e8, bishop d2, knight f5, rook f3, knight h4, well, and here knight h4 I played with the idea of going to the end game. I don't know if it's the best way to play. I think I should have played here for the middle game and played h5, knight h6, and then try h4. Knight h4 is not the best idea, but I like to play a good positional endgame, so I played this way. So rook takes f4, queen takes g6, knight takes g6, g takes f, and f5. Black is a pawn down, but black has absolutely sufficient counterplay. Bad bishop. Knight is much better than a bishop, always in these positions, because too many pawns on the board, and potentially very good square on f4. d5, knight f8, king f2, knight d7, bishop c3, knight c5, bishop d4, knight e4 check, king e1, king f7, a4, b6, a5, rook e7. A takes b, a takes b. Well, but the problem with this position for black is black has very good knight, very good outpost on e4. It doesn't feel like black is pawn down because these pawns are not really strong pawns, but black has white's black square bishop is very strong, and that makes it very difficult for black to win this game. So king f1 was played, g5, king g2, g4, rook a8, king g6. Game should have ended here in a draw. Rook g8, check, king f7, rook h8, king g6. And my opponent should have taken a draw because neither side has any advantage. He got overly ambitious here, and lost the game. King g6. And again, we repeated several times. And then he went rook c8. Now, this is actually a good example for someone when you play for win without any plan. That's bad idea. h5, h3, king h7, hg, hg, rook h6 check, king g6, rook g8, king f7, rook h8. But now black has an advantage. Rook e8, rook h5. Now why didn't he go rook h7 check and take on c7? That would have created a problem because actually this position that wasn't like this. King g6, rook e8 was played, but if check and take, there is rook a8 very strong and rook a2. Well, game was actually, it's not important part of the game because it was very much in a terrible time scramble, and this position is, black has a draw if they want to by going check and back, giving this pawn is very weak. So game ended after mistakes from both sides. Black won the game. This is not significant, but significant part was the first part of the game. Black again and again got very, very strong position after opening, and that's all that counts for you. So to summarize this system, what can we say? When you play, I don't know much of a theory. I don't know any theory of this opening as far as the theory goes, because there isn't any. As much as I know about this opening, I already mentioned. Now, of course, you may get some new positions. Well, I didn't get anything totally out of ordinary in like hundreds of games I have played. What are the chances that you're going to get something totally new for you? They're very slim. But if you know the basic ideas I showed you, you will be very comfortable if you understand every positional aspect, every plan there is for attack on the king side, for light squares, for closing center, for open. You're going to have very good opening in your arsenal against c4. The good thing is, if white plays c4 and you play e5, and if they change now to go to King's Indian or to go to, for example, Nimzo, they cannot do that. Once they play c4 and you play e5, they have to play English opening. Well, for example, on c4, if you go knight f6, they can switch to some other opening. But c4, e5, that's it. There will be already definitely English opening. And knowing those ideas I told you, you most likely and surely will get very playable and very comfortable position, very comfortable because you will know what your plan is. I really believe in this system. I've been playing it for a while all the time, and I am totally for it, and I really advocate for you to play it. Thank you very, very much.